Good evening, and thank you for your presence, for being here. Welcome to Villa Vassiliev. My name is Matilda Taszycka. I'm head of research programs at œillères, and I'm delighted to introduce the final event of the Présences Lesbiennes series, imagined by my dear colleague, researcher and art critic Anna Bordenave, on the initiative of œillères, Archives of Women Artists, Research and Exhibitions. This series aims to retrace a queer and lesbian artistic life from the 19th century onward, focusing on artists and works that have existed on the fringes of the established narratives of art history. This essential cycle for us is part of the celebration of the œillères' 10th birthday, 10th anniversary that we are celebrating this year. Publishing biographical notes on our website, and we have nearly 1,300 biographies today, made us observe how often their identities were rendered invisible in their official biographies. Some of these identities still remain contested, with feminist and lesbian reinterpretations still provoking debates, and we had recently in France this debate around the biography of Rosa Bonheur, for example, whose relationship was contested by some very conservative art historians. And so by delving into history, we aim to shed light on contemporary lesbian and queer culture, while also reversing this perspective and questioning how these contemporary cultures can shift our perspectives on art history. And this will be precisely the focus of tonight's presentation, I guess. And we are really thrilled and happy to welcome the one and only Professor Amelia Jones. From the University of Southern California. Amelia Jones is also curator and researcher specializing in contemporary art, performance, and feminist and queer studies. And Amelia's presentation will be followed by a screening of a film by Ashalik Sanyas. So I'm happy to hand on the mic to Anna Bordenave, who will provide more in-depth introduction to Amelia's work and the screening after.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here and present this talk with Amelia Jones and for this final event of this series. So to make a kind of history of this series of events, our main with this series was to present some of the research that exists on this topic, and with the hope of that this research will resonate to the audience in the future in the association with œillères. And it was important to us to open the conversation beyond the strict definition of who are the lesbian artists and what are the lesbian representation. And instead, we wanted to embrace the idea of a lesbian culture in art history that influences artist work, representation itself, but also the working practices and methodologies of artists and researchers. So at first, last June, we thought of inviting you, Amelia Jones, to the second event of this series in October. However, the program developed differently, and it seems to us that your research offers an interesting methodological art and historical perspective on the subject. And with your important work on feminist art history and performance, and your last book, In Between Subject, A Critical Genealogy of Queer Performance, your work highlights interaction between artistic practice, gender, and sexuality studies, and also create a link between visual art and activist, individual and collective affirmation. And today you are giving this lecture, Disorienting Feminism with Lesbian presence in art. And really thank you to develop this lecture for us. It's really important, I think, to embrace this subject here. And after this presentation, we will see the film, the short film Hermanas les Adelphes, so Hermanas, the siblings in English, directed by the artist Alex Sanyas. This short film is both an experimental documentary but also a vivid portrait of Kuko, who defined themselves as a transgender latex pirate. And this film, like your work, brings together performance, activism, and poetry as an embodiment of this performative main character, Kuko. And I hope that you will feel the connection that I felt between your work and the film. And then I will leave you with the mic.
Thank you so much. I apologize for not speaking French. When I speak French, I sound like an 8-year-old, so I prefer to sound like the person I am en anglais. I'm really excited to be here. Thank you so much. To Aware, to Camille, Matilda, Anna, etc. I really, really appreciate being here. I love coming to Paris, even though it's a very long way from Los Angeles. I'm just happy to be a part of this series as well. So with that, this is a new paper, so I've never given it before anywhere. It was prompted by your series, and I would love any feedback or questions afterwards. In October of 2015, a good 9 years ago now, I was lured into performing in a cultural event called Killjoy's Castle, a lesbian feminist haunted house produced by Canadian artists Alison Mitchell and Deirdre Loeb. I played a demented women's studies professor, narrating visitors' journeys, but also frequently taking breaks to wend my way through day-glow painted corridors, as you see here. Witches and goblins and ghosts abounded, such as the specter of Andy Warhol's erstwhile assassin, the radical lesbian Valerie Solanas, who helped keep people waiting in the long line to enter Occupied. Raucous music played on a mini stage outside by lesbian performers, including Los Angeles' own self-identified lesbian feminist musician, Frank, who you see on the right. This experience was both joyous and profoundly disorienting, mirroring, as was the intention stated by the artists, the fright evoked in normative mainstream culture by lesbian feminists and their histories. What Logan Mitchell totally got right and generously choreographed for the public is the terror that the specter of the lesbian, or the figure I am more expansively calling, in homage to today's boundary-blurring younger generations, the lesbo-queer, poses to heteronormative patriarchy. The lesbo-queer, in my definition, is the female-identified feminist who loves women, is self-identified as lesbian, and or femme or butch presenting in female spaces, and or is viewed by others as terrifyingly queer and anti-normative through their potentially anti-cis male demeanor. The lesbo-queer is definitely manifesting against the grain of the phantasmagorical figure of the straight, cis, white, patriarchal man at the origin of most of the intolerance and violence in Euro-American culture today. Logan Mitchell brilliantly evoked with Killjoy's Castle the terror that is still clearly instilled by the specter of the lesbo-queer in the minds of today's actively transphobic right wing in the US and beyond, particularly in the body of the trans woman, the trans femme, or presumed separatist lesbian who has no need for straight cis men. Importantly, however, they evoke this terror through destabilizing spaces and experiences that foreground disorientation, which I am spelling as disorientation, through which the lesbo-queer haunts the normative heteropatriarchal societies we continue to inhabit. And crucially, Logan Mitchell refused to keep the terror evoked in normative institutions and normatively minded people by the perceived lesbo-queer, aligned with the body of this person perceived as so disruptive. Killjoy's Castle offered or encouraged the person experiencing the clearly lesbian-haunted situation to sit with and ideally acknowledge their ownership of anxiety around the disorientation that the installation possibly evokes for them. Killjoy's Castle put the terror back where it belonged, with the person anxious about the lesbo-queer, not with the lesbo-queer herself. Expanding on this idea, here I explore a choice genealogy of the life work of creative lesbo-queer women who evoke or evoked anxiety in normative situations, including not just mainstream ones, but even the avant-garde art world, which until recently has been dominated by cis, straight white men. Apparently this Rosa Bonheur person is one of them. I do this through the lens of disorientation, a function that in Sarah Ahmed's influential formulation in her 2006 book, Queer Phenomenology, puts the onus of the recognition of otherness onto the disoriented person, not the putatively disorienting person. Therefore, I am arguing destabilizing and queering the very field of identification. Ahmed's theory begins from a phenomenological foundation and plays on the double meaning of orientation, both as a philosophical term indicating how we understand our place in space and time, and as a term commonly used to describe sexual identification. One's orientation in late 20th century discourse would relate not only to one's gender, but to one's sexual object choice, whether one was straight or gay lesbian. Ahmed asserts the starting point for orientation is the point from which the world unfolds, the here of the body and the where of its dwelling. In this context, moments of disorientation are vital. They are bodily experiences that throw the world up or throw the body from its ground, unquote. In Ahmed's terms, this state of disarray provides an opportunity of embracing the disorientation or deviance of queerness in relation to heteronormative society. Her method articulates a queer phenomenology which might start by redirecting our attention toward different objects, those that are less proximate, or even those that deviate or are deviant, unquote. What I'm arguing by Ahmed's model is that particular creative lives and creative works can evoke an awareness of our contingency that rather than produce fear and reactive behaviors and policies, can, if we sit with and explore or even revel in our confusion, produce a different world wherein we take responsibility for our fear while also understanding and embracing, rather than desperately trying to escape, our dependence on the world of others around us. And this would include those who might confuse our sense of self, whether in terms of gender, sex, or otherwise. The lesbo-queer, one of the most damned, marginalized, and persecuted figures in the 20th and 21st century Euro-American society, including the art world, is thus a fascinating activating agent for this potential rejigging of how Euro-American subjects imagine ourselves in the world. While generations of philosophers, theorists, and activists have challenged the simplistic idea equating visibility with power as positing a naive and absolutist belief in the transparency of intention, action, and result, this collapse of a kind of belief in intentionality remains embedded in our concept of political power as well as political agency. This has been especially the case with activism based on coalitional rights movements. Movements that have been driven, and in some instances, such as the majority of lesbian feminist activists in theory from the 1970s and 1980s and lingering into the present, permeated by essentialist concepts of identity and meaning. In fact, in response to my posting on social media about giving this lecture in Paris, I received an email, as you see here, sent by someone who calls herself Joan of Arc, with the subject header, Lesbian Rage, which chastised me for daring to presume I could write about a lesbian presence in art as a presumptively non-lesbian person. Leaving aside for the moment the insulting insinuation of this person who thinks they know something about my sex life, I noted in response to them, your email is a perfect example of the unfortunate and reactionary essentializing that still goes on in conversations and activism around identity issues of all kinds. Interesting that you've reduced queer implicitly to a function of sexual object choice, for example. And probably most importantly for me is I called for allyships rather than animosity. And I told them that I was going to be using their email in this talk, so they are forewarned, and of course they've never revealed themselves to me, so. I am on record honoring the historical necessity of some moments of essentialism in coalitional politics. But after a certain point, and certainly in this recent example, they can be counterproductive and even dangerous. Given public and violent attacks on trans people and women in the US right now in particular, we need all the coalitional allyship across whatever identifications we think the person is aligned with. We need all of these that we can get. In the least helpful cases, as with this email, we end up with crude identity politics arguments wherein it is claimed that one need only, and is in fact required, to be identified a certain way to be inherently destined to speak the truth about that identity or group. Note that the word authenticity is often used in these arguments. Many theorists have commented on the problem of assuming identity to be determinable or fixed, or even generative of the truth in this way, such that, per Joan of Arc's email, by speaking or making, they are guaranteed to deliver the truth. As well, the corollary idea that a person thought to be of a certain identity need only speak or become visible to claim political power has also been criticized and debunked. Building on a more nuanced understanding of how identification and meaning actually arise in complex situations involving contemporary art and performance, situations that are always relational, as I have theorized elsewhere, and as Ahmed's model makes clear, I will explore here what I call the life work of exemplary lesbo-queer creative women in the 20th and 21st century Euro-American context. By life work, I am referring not only to objects or images or performances, but to these lesbo-queers' ways of living and modes of creativity that either deliberately or implicitly challenge oriented and thus normative modes of being and making. Through their life work, they activate their bodies in space and time to invite us to engage, but by way of disorienting us. As suggested above, this disorientation is not arbitrary or accidental. It is tied to the political and aesthetic energies put forth by the artists in question. And just one more definitional moment, and then I'll launch into the artist. The life work of the lesbo-queer creative person does not rely on her selfhood as the origin of truth. She activates herself in work and expressions that are rather disorientingly queerish, to use the words of curator and artist Ken Gonzalez-Day in labeling the resonances of the photographic works in an exhibition he organized in 2023 of queerish photographs of same-sex desire and identification from the 19th century to the present. Queerish included historic images of couples and groups who look queer to us. Many are shown in states of intimacy with companions of the same sex, as in this image, but would not have identified as queer given that the term as we now understand it is a later 20th century concept. The show explored the role of photographs in shaping what Gonzalez Day calls queer imaginary as a critical space that is exploratory, precarious, celebratory, potentially unseen, and subject to change according to who encounters the images. The productions we encounter from the broader range of life work I explore here encourage us to sit with our confusion that these creators might instill in us, take responsibility for our confusion, think about our own orientation, sexual and otherwise, and question our desire to move toward or away from these potentially disorienting bodies and objects. My first deep engagement with a life work that challenged or changed the way I thought about an entire period and movement in Western art history, a life work I would now characterize as lesbo-queer, was my encounter with the Baroness von Freytag-Loringhoven. Born Elsa or Elsa Plutz in provincial Germany in 1874, the Baroness moved to New York City around 1913 and was briefly married to the Baron von Freytag-Loringhoven, the son of a very well-known, even in the US, German World War I general with the same name. So you can imagine what it would have been like for someone willfully adopting that name in the middle of World War I. The younger Baron, shortly after their marriage, left to fight in World War I, became a prisoner of war and died in captivity, but she retained his name. In my book, Irrational Modernism, A Neurasthenic History of New York Dada from 2004, I write extensively about the Baroness as a destabilizing force in the streets of New York, foreign, aggressive, and even bearing the name of a German general, as well as in the heteronormative male avant-garde in New York City during World War I, part of which was the group of men defined retrospectively to have comprised New York Dada: Francis Picabia, Van Rey, and Marcel Duchamp. I describe how, while the Baroness's sexual desires seem to have been oriented towards the heterosexual, they were voracious and predatory, masculine-seeming in the bourgeois codes of the time. But it was her close and long-standing associations with lesbian avant-gardists, including Juna Barnes, as well as Margaret Anderson and Jane Heap at the literary magazine The Little Review, to which the Baroness contributed her poems, that gave her some form of orientation from which to disorient and terrify male avant-gardists such as William Carlos Williams, Man Ray, and even the otherwise equanimous Marcel Duchamp. So poor Duchamp was followed and loudly addressed by the Baroness, who said she had a passionate crush on him and wrote him a note in 1923 that stated simply, "Marcel, Marcel, I love you like hell, Marcel." And there's many amazing stories about her you can see in my New York Dada book. I point out in my book that the Baroness's irrational effects, which I'm now calling disorienting, perform the seedy and seamy underside of modernism. And this is even avant-gardism, like she terrified these men who thought of themselves as very radical. These discourses of high art and architecture had labored to contain this kind of disorientation through their dominant models of rational practice. I argue that the Baroness wore the disorienting and violent effects of modernity on and through her person, including a mode of butch femaleness that was at home with lesbian avant-gardes, but in its sex-gender deviance, deeply threatening to the members of the male-dominated avant-gardes of the time. Living in poverty and circulating in bohemian circles in New York City, the Baroness was notoriously performative, producing a kind of contingent and theatrical selfhood by dressing herself in outlandish outfits, including bird cages with a live bird and a working taillight on her rear end. She often collected items off the street or stole them from department stores to complete these creative and wild costumes, some of which you see here, including the bird cage on the shelf on the left image. We know of this through a cluster of remaining pictures, such as these images here, some of which were taken by local journalists who obviously got word of this outlandish person, and some of them were taken by Man Ray, as well as through elaborate descriptions by friends of the Baroness, and I quote a lot of those in my book. The Baroness in her extreme persona sets the stage for an understanding of the disruptive quality of the lesbo-queer in relation to dominant narratives about modern art. As we look back on them today, Gertrude Stein and Claude Cahun exemplified this disorienting quality as well, but in contrasting ways. In two photographs you see here, both of which were included in Gonzales Day's Queerish exhibition, Stein presents her well-known butch lesbian persona. And in one, she stands with her lover and companion Alice B. Toklas as they arrive in New York City in 1934. As is well known, they generally lived together in Paris as American expatriates. In this latter portrait, the one you see on the right, we experience the legendary reticence of Toklas and the brash butch bravado of Stein in full force in the photograph. Here, the picture seems to say, the life work of the two famous lesbian lovers is mutually sustained and openly illustrated. Stein's radical lesbo-queer fiction and life worked hand in hand with Toklas's support to sustain a creative life that also nurtured others. Her salon, or their salon, I should say, in Paris is legendary and was the site of American and French literary and artistic figures mingling. The poems, the self-presentation, Stein's assertiveness comes across consistently in the many photographs of her. The work she and Toklas did to sustain an active creative environment at their home in Paris all conspired to make one version of creative lesbianism highly visible, at least in artistic and literary circles. Stein and Toklas, who shared an open lesbian marriage, so to speak, obviously wasn't legal, from 1910 until Stein's death in 1946, would not have thought of themselves as queer, which again was a term that early in the 20th century was rarely deployed. And when it was generally used as an epithet to define or label so-called sexual deviance by law enforcement. And I found evidence of the LA Police Department using it that way in the 1910s and 20s. But they were certainly, like Juna Barnes and Jane Heap and Margaret Anderson, open about their female-identified same-sex relationship. And of course, this was also the case with Claude Cahun, born Lucy Schwab in 1894. Cahun's photographic portraits were made in collaboration with her lesbian lover, Suzanne Malherbe, and the two images shown here were included in Gonzales Day's Queerish as well. Cahun, Jewish like Stein, but in this case from France, not from the US, and from a literary family, lived in Paris for most of her life with Malherbe, who also used a masculine pseudonym, Marcel Moore. The two also ran a salon in Paris and collaborated on writings, photographic works, legendarily the portraits of Cahun in her gender-bending embodiments from the teens through the 30s were probably all made in collaboration with Marcel Moore. And on their activism, they both worked actively in the French resistance in Jersey during the German occupation of France in World War II, and were both imprisoned at one point for doing so. Cahun's lesbo-queer mixing of masculine and feminine, or outright masculine self-presentation in the jointly produced images, is radically disorienting even now, and certainly at the time beyond their groups of bohemian friends would have been so. Cahun was explicit about her rejection of binary gender. In her 1930 memoir, Disavowals, she writes, quote, masculine, feminine, it depends on the situation. Neuter is the only gender that always suits me, unquote. And heads one of her sections with the quote, surely you are not claiming to be more homosexual than I. As Tirza Latimer, who is self-identified as a lesbian art historian, has noted, Cahun and Moore were life collaborators for nearly 40 years. In this sense, their life work was mutual and deeply lesbo-queer, as well as highly disorienting in the groups of heteronormative, male-dominated French avant-gardists that they tangentially occupied. In a doubled set of portraits illustrated by Latimer, we see the intertwined nature of Cahun and Moore. Not only was each devoted to the other in a lifelong lesbian partnership, their world-making was mutually sustaining and interactive. They seem to have become themselves, so to speak, through each other, as we imagine would have been the case for Stein and Toklas. As one Cahun biographer notes, they formed, quote, with Gertrude Stein and Alice Toklas, one of the great feminine couples of the century, unquote. Finally, this historical picture of a lesbo-queer version of the early 20th century avant-gardes would not begin to be accurate without attention to the wayward Black women in Saidiya Hartman's deeply informed and creatively speculative history, her book Wayward Lives from 2019. Hartman elaborates on the lives of these African-American women who were promiscuous, anarchic, and often explicitly non-normative in gender sex identification in early 20th century cities of the USA. In fact, she calls them queer radicals in the subtitle of her book. One of the most striking examples in Hartman's vivid account is that of Gladys Bentley, whom she introduces as, quote, entertainer, womanizer, African sculptor, flamboyant, and genderqueer stroller, unquote. Hartman's description comes partly from the Harlem poet Langston Hughes, who famously described Bentley as, quote, a large, dark, masculine lady whose feet pounded the floor while her fingers pounded the keyboard, a perfect piece of African sculpture animated by her own rhythm. Bentley's famous 1930s musical Harlem act at the Ubangi Club included her playing piano and singing bawdy lyrics while backed by a chorus line of drag queens. I wish I had been there. Herself, as here, dressed in men's clothing. Far from being completely crushed by the toxic stew of Jim Crow racism, sexism, and homophobia active in American society at the time, Bentley was highly successful in making a creative world for herself and career as a nightclub entertainer, while no doubt suffering from these exhausting forms of triple oppression. As well, Hartman points out in her book that at some point in the 1930s, Bentley had even married a white woman in a civil ceremony, putting her at risk when later that decade, cross-dressing started being persecuted as a crime, such that female performers had to apply for a license to wear men's clothing in their acts. These creative pioneers, or as Aware founder and curator Camille Morinot would have it, les pionnières of Euro-American avant-gardism and popular culture, were living creative and lesbo-queer lives that shifted, challenged, and refigured understandings of gendered selfhood at the time. They were disorienting the norms. But this door was slammed more or less shut in the mid-20th century, particularly with Hitler persecuting homosexuals, and just after World War II in the United States, the virulent attacks on gays and lesbians in the Lavender Scare, which grew out of the anti-communist Red Scare of McCarthyism. Bentley, in fact, exemplifies the powerful reorientation towards accepted gender sex norms in this period. She ostentatiously renounced her lesbianism in a 1952 story in Ebony magazine, which was an African-American, very popular magazine, in which she declared she had been cured of homosexuality by her marriage to a man, posing in the midst of various so-called female household chores, including making a bed and washing the dishes. During the Lavender Scare in the US, thousands of gays and lesbians, or those suspected on flimsy grounds of being so, were removed from their jobs and expelled to the margins of society. Compounding the discursive, political, and material violence of these moments, the disorienting bodies and productions of queerish creatives were routinely erased from art and cultural histories until the rise of feminism and LGBTQ+ rights starting in the late 1960s, which forced a reconsideration, not the least through artistic and scholarly homages paid to earlier queerish figures. And this would apply to the artist Susan Sultan's lesbo-queer performance gesturing to Gertrude Stein's presence as a queer feminist ancestor, which I turn to now. So I know that Sultan's work is not well known in Europe. I wish it were, but this gives you an idea of her early work where she's directly disorienting through these camera techniques, or in this case, it's a scanner that she's just moved her face across. Susan Sultan has long been a central force in the lesbian, queer, and feminist art circles of Los Angeles. The idea of addressing lesbian presence in art through the concept of disorientation, in fact, came to me through studying Sultan's works, such as these dramatically skewed self-portraits. Sultan disorients so as to produce a community of viewers who collectively experience the work as offering potential for being differently together. She brings us to awareness of how political violence and technology atomize us, thereby denying this atomization and pulling us into her world of powerful lesbo-queer community and agency. So I'm focusing here on Sultan's hour-long performative lecture, She Had a Laugh Like a Beefsteak, first presented in 2005 and ongoing, which plays explicitly and queerly with the knife edge between presence and absence, exposing, through deliberately disorienting and queerish strategies, the way in which a live presentation solicits our desire for living flesh, to solidify, to orient ourselves. The title of the piece refers to Mabel Dodge Luhan's description of Gertrude Stein's meaty laugh. So she said, quote, Gertrude Stein has a laugh like a beefsteak. Stein's prodigious love of meat resonating for Luhan in the sound of her laughter. Sultan's lesbo-queer performance throws in question the tendency in Western art discourse to erase or sideline the lesbo-queer voice. But by refusing to align the voice with the body, with the live body, She Had a Laugh Like a Beefsteak disorients the structure of authorship animating these discourses and exposes our desire for the voice of the artist to remain metaphorical, embedded in the work, or, if it's a live performance, to be one with that body. I first experienced She Had a Laugh Like a Beefsteak in 2008 at the University of Manchester, where I was teaching. I invited Sultan there to perform the work. And then again in 2012, I invited her to redo the work at McGill University when I had moved to Canada. And here I'm going to focus mostly on the McGill performance, but there'll be a little bit of the Manchester one too. It was in McGill's Art History Lecture Hall on a cold November day. And I'm going to describe it as if it's happening now. The lights are on. The audience members who anticipate a routine artist talk, a staple of art history and art departments, shift restlessly in their seats. Sultan's lecture is not, however, a standard artist talk. She riffs on the medium, spooling through various of her works, articulating her creative interests intelligently and with nuance, but she never actually speaks. The presentation overall includes a PowerPoint that is replete with replacements for her spoken voice, including written text embedded in the presentation, electronic avatars. Oh, and the sound isn't working, but you would hear on the left, she has a kind of computer-generated feminine voice, and on the right, a computer-generated masculine voice. I've learned from experience it's not even worth.
Okay. Okay.
You spend like 10 minutes trying to, I should have checked it ahead. There's a short video of vocal cords in action, which is really visceral. And also written text typed live as she's standing there, so it kind of shows up and there are typos, and she goes back and fixes it. And the verbalization of text, as well as she would hand out text to the audience and ask them to read her writing or her voice. The performance is highly disorienting. Sultan splits the voice from the live body. Having gone through a bout with laryngeal cancer, she inhabits and channels the unease of someone for whom the loss of speech and life was threatened, although most people there probably wouldn't know that. Sultan exaggeratedly enacts our desire for the artist to be both present to deliver the meaning of the works, and, as the high modernists required, supposedly absent, with the embodiment warded off so as to keep bodily messiness and desire at bay. So she kind of doesn't do either of those things. Sultan literalizes this split, making the voice representational rather than actual. So she divorces the voice from flesh. She thus forces artistic voice to function on a different register from her spoken articulations. The voice is not fully articulate, it is not delivering words. For example, speaking her words from a written text that I received in the audience, which also included a quotation of someone else's words, as well as her own, I found myself acutely aware of my tripled status as a voice, speaking my voice, but speaking for another who had transcribed the voice of a third person. No one subject, embodied or not, is clearly articulated or defined. We are all interrelated in the splitting, mimicking, doubling, merging of voices. Artistic presence is both asserted and completely undermined, such that our expectations are thwarted, our embodied selves brought into an awareness of the relationality of all subjects, the disorientation of the stable self promised in heteronormative patriarchy. It is only at the very end of the piece that we hear Sultan vocalize live in our presence. She leads the audience outside and directs us to join her in a final clarion call, handing out slips of paper instructing us to laugh on cue. It is only at this moment that we hear her voice joined with our own in a collective and forced roar of chuckling, chortling, and cackling. And it's really awful to be forced to laugh. There is a vibrational exchange among everyone there. Bringing people together to laugh in a public space is itself disorienting, especially in a WASP-based society like the UK or Canada or the US. Quebec, a little bit different. I feel surprised and off-kilter from this unexpected close of an almost speechless performance, but in the end, there's a kind of political affirmation in experiencing this with everyone there, including Sultan. If we are relational and interconnected, we understand that we cannot control others or ourselves. The world is a mystery, continually changing, and along with it, we change. While with the conventional model of political agency based on Eurocentric ideas of individual agency and directly chosen actions, this might signal disaster, Sultan's silent articulations disorient Western heteropatriarchal definitions of self and arguably open a door to collective being. Laughing together, we are joined in an act of mutual sustenance. Collective being, interbeing, or relationality recognizes the interrelatedness not only of people in relation to each other, but of course of animals, plants, the earth, objects, rocks, everything within human comprehension. What is suggested by theories of collective being is that we cannot survive any longer immersed in regimes of division. And this is kind of, you're feeling this with this work. Sultan's work actualizes this disorientation through strategies that bring us into the aesthetic and political experience of the work. As she voiced in a 2016 audio work consisting only of her voice, which you can access on her website, I highly recommend it, 1,533 days out from November 8th, 2016, either we heal as a team or we're going to crumble. And she's actually parroting the macho words of the football coach played by Al Pacino in a film about football. And it's in reference to Trump having been elected in 2016. I hope she does something even more extreme this time. The next works I want to look at are those of Laura Aguilar. I can't remember when I first saw Laura Aguilar's work, but it was sometime in the early 1990s when I encountered In Sandy's Room and other self-imaging photographs, such as this gorgeous nature self-portrait series. I was astounded by her clarity and formal rigor in presenting herself in these pictures. I included her work in my exhibition Sexual Politics in 1996. I invited her to visit my class. What I didn't know at the time but came to appreciate later was that her body of work included series of works committed to documenting queer, Latina, and artistic communities she hung out with in Los Angeles. Particularly well known now are the late 1980s and early 1990s Latina, Lesbienne, and Plush Pony series, the latter of which portrayed women at the BIPOC lesbian bar in El Sereno by the same name. And El Sereno is really just Los Angeles, but it's East Los Angeles, which is very Latino community. In the Latina lesbian pictures, Aguilar recognizes this community through portraits and texts in what appears to be the handwriting of the person depicted. She's naming and making visible Latina lesbians explicitly through photography and text. For example, in Latina Lesbians, Carla, 1989, a defiant woman stands in a leather jacket looking assertively at us. The text below reads, "My mother encouraged me to be a court reporter. I became a lawyer, Carla Barboza, Esquire." So a court reporter in the United States would be basically the secretary, the feminine job, right? And in Latina Lesbians Cookie, 1988, the subject stares out with a passionate gaze, and the text begins, "I am a proud Latina lesbian, and I do flaunt it." Laura Aguilar noted that the Latina lesbians she documented in this series were all professionals, and that she turned to the Plush Pony bar to find working class Latina lesbian subjects. As James Estrella has argued through extensive quotes from Aguilar's diaries and letters, she was, however, deeply ambivalent about hanging out in this working class bar, traumatized by the hardscrabble lives and heavy living of the Plush Pony patrons. In her diary, she notes, for example, quote, "A lot of these women have been in and out of jail, mostly for dealing drugs," unquote. associating their choices with her own family members' struggles with drugs and alcoholism, and her brother had recently died of alcoholism. Estrella rightly situates the Plush Pony series as well, squarely within the context of the 1992 Los Angeles uprising. It was the same month and moment that Aguilar was making this series. And Estrella notes the costs of neoliberal policies for people of color and the poor, such as Aguilar and her family, that were both causing the uprising and were affecting these women in Plush Pony Bar. He also critically but sympathetically examines the tendency of Aguilar and others to follow the lead of neoliberal leaders by interpreting their suffering as individual in genesis, rather than as caused by systemic inequality. In this sense, then, it was Aguilar herself, as much as the women in the images, who felt disoriented from mainstream society, but they were also disorienting to that society. The photographs, which honor making, looking, posing as relational processes, where we are brought as viewers into the convivial scenes, themselves do a kind of work honoring and solidifying community which Aguilar may or may not have been able to imagine at the time. Viewed today, Plush Pony number 7 and 15 document female-to-female love, desire, and camaraderie as transformative and disorienting to the very neoliberal mainstream power structure and dominant narratives that, as Estrella argues, were really the culprits responsible for these women's and Aguilar's alienation and marginalization. We become more aware in engaging Aguilar's portraits, particularly the self-portraits, that her radical, vulnerable, emotional self is also a thinking, feeling subject with creative agency, one who articulates her own disorientation and confusion about being human, and in so doing affords viewers the opportunity to engage relationally in a complex shuttle of belief, desire, and longing. Even just for this reason alone, Aguilar's is a highly effective and affective practice. She gives voice to the radically vulnerable self, a self that is also clearly marked as lesbo-queer. And the final artist whose work I'm looking at is Castles. When I first met the artist now known as Castles in the early 1990s, their name was Heather Castles, and they were an integral part of the lesbian feminist art collective, the Toxic Titties. The core 3 members of the collective, including Castles, Julia Steinmetz, and Clover Leary, were at the time members of the, at the time MFA students at the California Institute for the Arts, or CalArts, which is a very vibrant presence in Los Angeles. And they invited me to give a lecture there in 2002, at which point I started following their work. The most memorable early works they produced, to my mind, were Toxic Union from 2002, in which they performed a marriage by figuring out a legal way to incorporate as a 3-person married unit. And this, of course, was also before gay marriage was legalized. Their related video spoofing an IKEA ad as a lesbo domestic farce, and their 2002 piece, VB Intervention, in which 2 of them, Castles and Leary, applied for a position in, were accepted into, and thus infiltrated one of Vanessa Beecroft's controversial durational gallery installations, consisting of naked white women standing in spike heels, here at the Gagosian Gallery in Beverly Hills in 2002. The group called it a parasitical performance in a brilliant paper entitled Behind Enemy Lines Inside Vanessa Beecroft, which I highly recommend, which they jointly published for a 2006 special issue of Signs, a Journal of Women in Culture and Society, on feminism and visual culture. I co-edited with Jennifer Doyle. So I'm trying to be really honest about like how invested I am in these artists, if it's not clear. The performance infiltration and paper brilliantly exposed the anti-feminist exploitation built into Beecroft's pieces, which were at the time shockingly being treated by some as feminist performance masterpieces. And this happened across the international art world, funding Beecroft's career as a global art star. Castles and Leary joined the arduous and unpleasant week-long preparations. For example, they had to have their entire bodies waxed, including their pubic areas. They had to submit to white body paint being sprayed on their bodies. They had to stand for hours for photo shoots, being forced to urinate while holding their labia open so as not to disturb the body paint, et cetera, et cetera. And then they had to endure the 3-hour public performance at Gagosium, which I attended. They had begun the process with plans to disrupt the piece. Castles had wanted to drop a raw egg out of their vagina. So good. But from early on, they realized this was not possible. Beecroft's controlling staff, for example, the male production manager who would relay instructions from the artist, had all the models sign a contract stating that if one person broke the rules, as you see here, all the models would lose their pay. So it was a way of enforcing conformity, thereby rendering it impossible for a left-wing feminist activist like Castles to proceed with the plan. Castles was very clear from the beginning that Beecroft's obvious exploitation of female labor and violent objectification of female bodies were offensive and required interruption. I would add that not only does Beecroft force white women into a heteronormative matrix of gazing and desire heightened in the gallery setting, she also explicitly racializes the situation, which of course is already there if they're all white and they're in white body paint. But many people are white in the art world and wouldn't see the racialization unless there was literally an Asian woman whose skin was not whitened, who had clearly long black hair, and who was wearing brown and not white spike heels. And it was also racialized by the clearly not considered fact that the Gagosian security guards were all African American men wearing black suits. I don't think she even noticed. It is very difficult to find images of either of these online. This was the closest I could get, and I've noticed that neither of these points are written about at all. So it's as if she, realized how offensive it was, or I don't know. As a witness to this work, I could feel not only my anger at the all too typical objectification of the white women, which was being claimed as ironic by Beecroft's handlers, but also at the unacknowledged class and racial hierarchies clearly being enacted through this guard versus artwork situation. Even today, the Gagosian website illustrates VB46 with this photograph you see on the left, which they priced in the tens of thousands of dollars as a photograph, showing Castles and Leary front and center. So Castles is right here and Leary is just third from the left. With the chiseled muscles of Castles' bodybuilder physique clearly airbrushed out. I'm just saying this was taken at that time, and you can tell they made an effort to remove that. An image made later by Castles and available on Castles' website shows them getting revenge by posing with their muscles bulging as they hold the airbrushed image. As Steinmetz sums up just one of the many problems of this work, quote, Beecroft's request for flat-chested, boyish-looking girls with short hair in her call for models invokes the physical characteristics historically associated with the congenital mannish lesbian, but the Gagosian press emphasizes their resemblance to Greek choroi, erasing queerness as an organizing factor, just as they erase Castle's butch muscles. Both Leary and Castles add extensive first-person descriptions of the week-long process to the article in Signs, including Castle's acknowledgement that, in spite of their desire to interrupt the piece, I was powerless in this situation. Ultimately, Castles did have their revenge, though, as well, in the form of an internal refusal of the grossly orienting controls of Beecroft's situation, and invoking of their own lesbo-queer imaginary, which involves seeing themselves both as collectively amongst a group of other strong, desirable women, and as specific in their own lesbo-queer desire. I don't know why that's showing up. And this is Castles in that article. Quote, I had to flip this otherwise intolerable situation into something undeniably erotic. I would pass the time while posing by imagining the intricacies of possible sexual encounters with my fellow models. It was not long before I was imagining pinning or being pinned down by these hard, strong women on the cool cement gallery floor. As I stood still as a statue for the buyers and collectors, inside I was gripping and licking and fucking, unquote. Wish they'd been able to do that. In a sense, all of Castle's works after the Beecroft intervention and during their process of the more and more open transitioning into trans masculinity address this interrelation between collective and individual desire, between the hugely powerful and muscular masculine body and the fierce lesbo-queer desire of that body. For example, with Becoming an Image with Becoming an Image and Powers That Be, you see them battling with themselves or with a mass of clay in a really intense and physical way. And in Solo Flex, done a few years later, they are kind of struggling with this extremely large and heavy pane of glass. As they transitioned into an openly trans male person, their work becomes increasingly physical, and they wield their body like a powerful tool to gain but also to question physical violence as the sole mode of power available to the masculine gendered sex body. And then finally, less than a month ago, Castles debuted an exhibition at Site Santa Fe in New Mexico entitled Movements, where their work of the last decade highlighting trans rights is brought together with gorgeous cinematic projections and sound work that brings the live performances into a more permanent relationship with the art gallery. Featuring the work Human Measure, the show presents trans bodies, all trained as dancers except Castles, dancing in public spaces, from a theater to a public park, imprinting their joyously, angrily, vigorously moving bodies onto either sensitized fabric, which you see here, the cyanotypes, or the sand earth itself, rather than working to disappear, as would be totally understandable for safety in the current virulently transphobic context in the United States, or attempting to assuage viewers' anxieties by orienting themselves in relation to binary sex gender norms, these bodies, including Castle's own, insist on the impossibility of full and final orientation as an opportunity rather than a threat. While we stand literally immersed in the luscious sounds and images of these installations, we become part of them. And I wish you could hear the sound. The sound is basically so this is reflected in this pool of water, and the sound is actually Eve Klein's monotone symphony sung by trans singers and mixed professionally and everything. So it sounds really haunting. And the under the water are bass woofers so that whenever it goes low, the water vibrates and the image vibrates. Very beautiful one. So while we stand immersed in these sounds and images, we become part of them. At the same time, it's important to point out that the trans bodies subjects don't seem to care about us. They don't bother openly attacking or flaunting their lesbo-queer trans bodies. They simply exist in their own energized collective, dancing and moving together, making their own non-binary systems of representation. Castles, the lesbo-queer artist, situates themselves within and orchestrates this world as community, supporting, nurturing, and befriending their collaborators. This is the lesbo-queer world we need, disorienting but not antagonistic world making, but not oblivious to the disorientations of the rest of the world. The lesbo-queer life work I explore here pushes into new domains. In conclusion, these recent projects expand on the disorientations of the Baroness Gertrude Stein and Claude Cahun by continually seeking out the ways in which staging an aesthetic experience through visuals, sound, and space can produce new ways of understanding, but also new worlds, and even possibly new ways of being in the world that are not oriented, but rather open to others. If right-wing politicians and culture warriors around the world are insistent on creating division everywhere, building on the atomizations that exist in a post-Enlightenment world distorted by binary thinking and by individualism, as well as on the mass psychoses of fascism, Sultan, Aguilar, and Castles contribute to a vital conversation about how to embrace lesbo-queer disorientation in a different way. These performative works stress being together, supporting and sustaining, experiencing the disorientations of contemporary human life and their own feelings of disorientation with courage and compassion rather than fear. Thank you.
Thank you a lot. If there are some questions for Amelia, John? Or,
C'est en français, ça peut être en français et on peut traduire. Je crois qu'Amélia comprend.
Oui, je sais pas.
oui, donc vous pouvez parler en français si vous avez quelques questions.
Hello, I have a question which is a little bit off the track, although I was when you were talking about the prehistory and Freytag Loringhoven and the American art scene in the 1910s, and so I thought of Sadie Mae and all these female lesbian collectors of the early 20th century, and I was wondering, so it's not really your topic, but I was wondering to what extent an investigation of those collecting practices of lesbian, queer, female collectors, well, like Gertrude Stein, although not writers,
Yeah.
could be an interesting thing to explore, and maybe even pushing it into the future, into a more contemporary era.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's why I choose the term life work, because I'm not talking just about the actual artworks, even of Stein, right? I'm talking about exactly that bigger picture of how she created a world with Alice B. Toklas. So the collecting is part of that. I don't know Sadie Mae, was she here?
No, she was at Baltimore. It was
Oh.
Sadie and her sister. They were based in Baltimore. I know them because they were collectors of Dubuffet.
Okay.
A lot, but and I know there were a few of these.
There were,
There
yeah.
were, independent women collectors
Yes.
who were in fact all lesbians.
Oh, that's great.
It's,
Yeah, I think that was very common, and also the salons, you note Cahun and Moore, Stein and Toklas, and then Margaret Anderson and Jane Heap were running the little reviews. So it was very common that these women who had some cultural agency were also lesbian. And I have no idea, you'd have to really think that one through. Either they're drawn to that because they're already independent of the kinds of ties that can cripple women being attached to men, or, you know, I don't know which causes which, but it is really interesting in that period.
I have a question, because all the work you presented, the works, was related to collective experiences some way. And so, well, I just, does it seem necessary to have this disorienting experience for you, to this collective experience too?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it is necessary for me, but they're different. I mean, I'm kind of making Laura Aguilar's work relational, right? Like, I knew her as a person. I didn't know her as well as I know Susan and Castles, but so I know a little bit about her shyness and reluctance and discomfort with actually being part of a collective. So that's why I mentioned that. I didn't want to like create the impression that she was. When I first saw those plush pony photographs, I thought, oh my God, this is so great. She was really having a good time. And then it turns out in her journal, she was expressing distress and a disconnect. So I didn't want to paper that over. But I still feel that especially the plush pony photographs actually, just whatever Laura's ideas at the moment of taking the photograph, there's so much about lesbian collective joy, you know, because they are in that space. And so for me, it's very welcoming, just the way those women look. They're not looking at each other, they're clearly interested in Laura and looking at the camera and, you know, maybe thinking about future viewers. So that I kind of distort them slightly to fit my vision of them. But I think I wrote this paper over the last month, and, you know, I'm just like trying to figure out what the heck to do, because they are directly attacking trans people. And so for me, and then I got that email from Joan of Arc, I'm like, what? You know, like, what? Like, I thought the whole point was for as many people as possible, to address this work, you know, and the allyships and the just refusal to be atomized and broken, because that's what they want. They want us all to be fighting with each other instead of telling them to fuck off as a collective, and that's what we need to do. And so the more I was writing this, that all kind of came out. I feel like I'm a part of these worlds. And needless to say, I showed Susan and Castles the email, and they were like, what? Just to make sure I wasn't like crazy. Yeah, and that email just was exactly the kind of atomization that the far right wants to create, where we get stuck in our little, you know, tiny little identity world, assuming we know who other people are, assuming everyone else is the enemy, and we forget to protect each other. And so that's why that became so central to the paper. And then I also just went to Castle's show at Site Santa Fe, which is very much about collectivity and trans, but as well, I would argue, lesbo-queer collectivity. Yeah.
Est-ce qu'il y a d'autres?
Just to follow what you are speaking about, do you think that in the area you live in Los Angeles and California, do you think there is something specific about the communities?
Yeah.
Because it's what I feel, but it's like an intuition for me. Is there something really specific in the territory there about this question of relation and community at work? Or
Yeah, thank you for asking that. Of course, it's like invisible to me that it's all from Los Angeles, but pretty obvious. I do, but you know, the last time I lived in New York was a long time ago, so I don't know, it feels different to me, but then I don't live in New York now. It feels different to me coming to Paris, but I don't live here, so I don't, so it's hard for me to say. I hope there are these interconnections and communities here. I assume there are.
To extend my question or my interrogation, it's because of this performance territory, and it seems like there is something which is in link with to be in communities and to work together. But it's like historical, for me, it's like just an intuition. It's not.
No, for sure. And I've said things about it, but I haven't really rigorously theorized it. But Los Angeles has long been a center for performance and live art in, and the kinds of performance that are not at the Museum of Modern Art. The kinds that are not now being commodified in major museums. LA, for really 50 years, people have been doing crazy things and, warehouses and to my delight, that is still really happening. And if anything, it's even more dynamic now because there's more spaces. There is a nascent performance art museum, which could be terrible, but I'm on the board, so I'm gonna make sure it's not. Because, the fact that they want me on the board and I'm on record like saying performance should never be in a museum, I guess that's good. So there is something, and I think it has to do partly with the nature of the West Coast is just very far from official modernism and discourse. Not that obviously there were famous modernists who came from Europe to LA, but it's just more attenuated, and also there was no commercial art market until recently. And unfortunately now we have a Jeffrey Deitch and a Gagosian and all these terrible places that ruin things. But of course that also means there's more money, and sometimes that trickles down to the performance and the queer scene, which are very closely connected, as well as to the legendary feminist performance scene, which you know a lot about. So, and Carole has also stayed in my house, so when you first said where you live, I was like, do you mean my neighborhood? Talking about my cats that you take care of? But I do think there is something, I feel it, I'm in it, and I just love it so much, and it's why I wanted to move back to Los Angeles, actually, after being in England and then Florida.
I'm going to go a bit off track too. I want to go back to this amazing story of Baroness von Friedrich, telling about her love, Marcel, I love you like hell. And this is like enormous. What is your point of view about Marcel Duchamp not dressing up as a woman, but signing all his work as Rose C'est la vie for a long, long time? What do you think of that? There's big books written about that, which I'm not happy with.
Well, I wrote a book on Duchamp, actually.
Oh.
And there's a chapter
okay, I feel really bad.
On okay. But I wrote it before I really knew. I had heard of this character who, the thing I love about her is she kind of shows up everywhere, but in these tiny bits and pieces. And so I thought, well, I have to write a whole book where she's the one kind of haunting the whole thing. I think Duchamp was amazing, and I think it's fascinating that he was thinking across all sorts of boundaries, of course. That project, I feel like until someone finds the video recording that was in the room with Man Ray and Duchamp, which doesn't exist because there was no video, we just don't know. We don't know what exactly went on, whether it was a joke and they were playing around. Man Ray is definitely not open-minded about gender, having written my MA thesis on Man and being propelled towards Duchamp because he was so much more interesting. So I don't know. But it does something interesting, certainly, for historians. But again, it really wasn't known outside of a small group of people getting the tiny publications that were circulated amongst people in Europe and New York. So it did something interesting within that group. And then once those things were rediscovered, which is when I wrote my Duchamp book, was my dissertation, it was my first book. And I was irritated by the fact that everybody in New York was obsessed with Duchamp, they would say things like he's the father of postmodernism, and then they would say postmodernism has destroyed authorship. And I was like, well, that's a complete contradiction. So I'm the kind of person who wants to do the thing that you're told not to do, always. And so I thought, well, there's something more interesting here about the reception and construction of Duchamp by Americans in the post-World War II period. So that's what the first book is, and that's the context in which I look at it. But we just don't have more evidence, really, other than the photographs. And
just looking at the photo of Baroness, I just thought she looks so much like Duchamp dressed as a woman, as maybe he was
she's
trying
very
to
mannish
compete
in
with her.
appearance, yeah.
Because she was maybe stronger than him, and she
Oh, she
invented,
definitely could have kicked his ass.
Exactly.
He was like trying to avoid her because she was, understandably, she was a bit much.
But where did you read that? You have
All the stuff about the Baroness?
yeah, and Duchamp.
You have to find it in all these like, what's his name? It was there was a modernist living in New York, a guy who was friends with some of these little review people who wrote a chapter where he writes about it. But you have to go and find it. And then also, while I was writing Irrational Modernism, I met this wonderful Canadian woman, Irene Gamble, who was writing a biography. And it was great, because I had a young child and I couldn't really travel, but she was doing all the footwork and had all the early German history and the whole trajectory of how the Baroness ended up in New York. So if you want the biography, there is a wonderful biography in English by Irene Gamble.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
And I was completely off the track, but I think she does look like Duchamp as Rosé Davy. Oh, he wants to look like her. I don't know.
Well, there is a fashion thing of the time, but also she has probably a more mannish face than Duchamp, actually, to be honest. He had that beautiful, fine features. But these pictures are amazing. And these were only discovered fairly recently in an archive from this magazine, which unfortunately is now owned by Bill Gates. It's owned by Corbis. So no one can afford to reproduce these.
So any other question from the room?
Hey, thank you for your presentation. Firstly, I'm not sure I can sort my question correctly, but I want to ask one thing. For the whole presentation, I just come up with I would like to ask you about the some sort of gap or a difference of perspective between the Europe and the US, and also or more people of color. Because I found some sort of those queerness or how you present the presence of a queer artist, which is somehow focusing on more a physical presentation, somehow there's, it's not, of course not everything, but it's really focusing on a physical presentation. Then I found for example more a Asian country. I'm from Asia, then but it's there's somehow how you present the queerness is more like the focus is way less, because like it's like there's like more like a physical advantage, or like there's like a much somehow less obvious.
Yeah.
Also like you know, you can also see some like Asian subculture thing. Just like it's not really like a masculine character. It's not really like a somehow not really like a priority to show off the masculinity, for example. Then like also that somehow makes the difference between the terms of the masculinity in here and other people of color. For example, like I'm a performer, but still have like some, I'm not really like a masculine, like a bulky body. Then it's also like I saw a lot of like a female female dancer, or like a other athlete has like a somehow like a physical advantage than me even. And also I'm actually traveling from Berlin, and that I found out that there's some sort of problem of the queer community in Berlin right now. There's just like somehow it's more like focusing on presence rather than how they are how they are actually
kind of visibility. You mean?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So like more like a just somehow those presence, or like how you accept the how you accept your own self. It's just those kind of way of thinking somehow like a undercover and in a more like a presence, or like more like a way of like showing those like showing how you follow the trend of like
Right.
yeah.
I
So
mean,
just
I think you're pointing out how contextual it is, right? Like at different moments, in different places, the pressures are different. And so the way I'm writing this, as I said, is very much like where I'm at right now, dealing with this horror of what's happened. And the community is dealing with it. And it sounds like in Berlin there's been a shift. I'm not sure I quite get what the shift is, but a shift towards being visible rather than joining together, or?
Yeah, but it's like, it's still like some sort of solidarity is a very important fact that the queer scene that's sure I have an understanding, but like I somehow see like a it's hard to explain in one word, but somehow tend to rejecting the people who's like really like not cool, like it's have to be like a showing the.
So there's a kind of, in a different way, it's a different use of the term performative. That's negative.
Yeah,
but it's a kind of performative queerness, and if you don't do it right, you're somehow not part of the group, or.
I found it like somehow a bit weird when I saw the performance. I forgot the name with the masculine trans artist who just like
The recent
holding glasses, or because
the Castle's work.
yes. Like for example, this work basically works. It won't work if the audience doesn't know the context of like how they are like how they're like discriminated discriminated by her like past experience by their
maybe, but I think it would work in any heteronormative society because their body is so confusing, and they kind of play on that.
That's my point, because like
but this is like a, it's really similar to like a Asian male body, actually, for example.
Well, except it doesn't have a penis, so.
Right. Well, yes. Well, it's like a. It's,
So there's different things going on that are so obviously at odds in terms of the norms.
Yeah, exactly.
As far as how it resonates in queer culture, I mean, honestly, it would be different because they now live in New York, so I think it would read differently in New York from how it reads in LA.
Yeah, that's why I want to
Yeah.
think like, how should we merge those gaps.
Well, I don't think we can or necessarily we should. I mean, every context has its own political urgency, right? So for me, I just focus on the political urgency of where, what I'm looking at, where it is, what we need to do. And these people I know, I'm asking what I can do as an ally. You know, I guess that's my main concern.
I think we want to thank you, Amelia, so much
Thank you.
for an amazing presentation.